Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us again this evening. For those who are new to our webinar series, my name is Michael, and on behalf of Whale Coast Conservation, a very, very warm welcome to this cold Thursday evening. If you've missed any of the last 6 conversations we've had, you are more than welcome to go onto our Facebook page or our YouTube page, and you can see all the recordings there. We've got another 4 really exciting talks lined up in this series. Next week, we have John Costello, who's going to join us and talk about the Wild Coast and some of the hidden secrets that are there. And now I'm sure you are as inquisitive as I am to find out how Swati found her amphibious soul and how she came from India to fall in love with the great African sea forests. Swati, could you take us from the beginning, how you came from India to be here, and just a little bit of background? I thought you'd be better at introducing yourself than I would be.
Yeah, so I'm essentially by profession a environment and conservation journalist, also a storyteller and documentary filmmaker. I worked for a company back home in India called New Delhi Television, and I started my reporting career about 23 years ago now, and I started with tigers. When I went into NDTV and I started work in 1997, tigers were in big crisis in India. Their numbers were crashing, so that's where I started my reports. And then doing a lot of news stories, I started a show on NDTV called Born Wild, that I used to present and research and write and script as well. It took me all across India, and I essentially looked at wildlife conservation and environment challenges that we faced in India. And a lot of my work helped change some policy and helped bring attention to a lot of the problems that we had, and also to a lot of the successes that we had. I'm in India, and of course I got to meet some amazing non-human beings, and I got to spend amazing time in some amazing places. So that was really, in a nutshell, what I did in India for about 20 odd years. I still do some work when I go back to India, and yeah, so that's what I did with live television. So the tropical jungles of India are really the forest. That's where I spent most of my time. Pretty much about 3 weeks in a month, I was away somewhere in India, if not the jungles, the mountains, if not the mountains, the swamplands, if not the swamplands, mangrove forests. So incredible experiences. Then I met Craig in 2006, and I moved here to South Africa in 2007 after meeting Craig. A little after I moved to South Africa, I still went back home 3-4 times a year, continuing to do work for India, and I started reporting on conservation challenges in South Africa on land. So again, amazing experiences, getting to go to amazing places, looking at the challenges here and how things were done here in terms of conservation and wildlife. And Craig, within a year of me getting here, made a promise for his own self to go into the ocean every day for 10 years. That was the promise he made to himself at the time. And I was busy writing my book. I wrote a book called Born Wild, My Journeys into India and Africa, after I was here for a couple of years, which was published about 2 years ago. But the ocean was a very difficult space for me to access. Although it's right here on my doorstep, this incredible wilderness, I really struggled to access it. It was cold, the water for me, for someone coming from a country with tropical waters. And in my country, I didn't grow up in a culture where we were easily or even every day in the water. I didn't grow up swimming in the ocean. I didn't grow up being on the beach the whole time. Although I grew up in a coastal city and I did go to the beach, I didn't really go into the water that much. There wasn't really that much of a culture of ocean sports at the time when I was a child. Also, yes, my parents sent me for swimming lessons. And when I was very young, I think my 3rd or 4th lesson, I don't know what happened, something with the coach, and I nearly drowned. And they had to sort of rub my back to get water out of my system. And that caused a lot of trauma for me when it came to water. So that was another big reason. The ocean was too vast, too open, too unpredictable. And my fear just wouldn't let me access it. Of course, being with Craig and then meeting amazing people who then, because Craig established the Sea Change project with Ross, and they wrote that wonderful book, Sea Change, with Pippa, who edited it. I met all these wonderful Sea Change members, and they were all so comfortable in the water, these amazing people who spent almost every day in the water. And I had this weird push-pull towards it. I was jealous that I couldn't be like them in the water, but at the same time, too scared to go in. So I started slowly just literally going on these intertidal walks with Craig and the others, where I would, see these amazing creatures in the intertidal pools, learn about them, figure out their little lives, how it connected to the kelp forest, how everything worked. And I would go in for the occasional dip, still fully in a wetsuit, sometimes even in a life jacket when I swam so I could float, because I was still very scared. But to about 2.5, 3 years ago, I realized that as a conservation journalist, if I wanted to talk about ocean conservation in South Africa or anywhere really, I couldn't do those stories without being authentic about my experiences. In all my stories that I've done out of India, and all the time that I reported as a wildlife and conservation journalist, there is not a single story that I've done that I haven't physically been to the area, the space, the ecosystem, the animal. I've never phoned in a story. So kayaking got me into the water because that I felt comfortable doing. Snorkel was the best thing that happened to me, because this idea that I could breathe while I flopped about in the water was really, gave me a lot more confidence than I had. And so I started going into the water more and more, initially on very, very calm days at low tide, within 3-4 meters, where I could still stand if I felt overwhelmed. But the snorkel really helped with me going in and getting an idea of what it is that I had missed for all those years that was right on my doorstep. And what I had missed was this extraordinary ecosystem. And of course, looking at, when Craig used to come back from his swimming experiences, and I used to look at the photographs he would take and the footage, of course, you get this extraordinary idea of what it is visually. Under the water, this forest that's under the water, the sea forest, under the water. But until you actually go in yourself and you see it for yourself and experience it for yourself, it's just indescribable what that revelation does to you. And that actually was what opened up my, I would say that I still have the fear, but my desire to be in the water became greater than my fear to be out of the water. So that's what I started doing a lot more, is going in, because just look at this environment. Who wouldn't want to be in there? So this amazing kelp forest that we have extends for almost 1,150 or 1,200 kilometers across the coast of Southern Africa up to Namibia. This kelp forest is mainly the Eclonia maxima kelp, and it's like I guess the general word for it would be brown seaweed, but that just sounds so dull and horrible compared to what this forest actually is. When you see it, it is a giant golden green floating ecosystem. It is as how shall I say, productive as any tropical forest on land. It's especially our kelp forest, because of the magic of this space and the things definitely that Craig and Pippa and Yanis and Ross and Karina and Fane and everyone in the Sea Change project team had experienced and seen and recorded. We came to realize that this isn't just a kelp forest. It had to have an identity of its own because it was so spectacular. So we decided to call it the Great African Sea Forest, to give it that separate identity. And the reason it requires that separate identity is because kelp forests are found, and maybe some people know about this, but if you don't, it's found in most temperate waters of the world, which means colder waters of the world. So 1/4 of the world's coastlines across the world actually have kelp forests. But the truth of the matter is that a majority of those forests are not doing great. In fact, nearly 40% of them are in grave decline. For various reasons and threats, climate change predominantly being the biggest reason, and warming waters. Our forest is one of the, I think, 26% of kelp forest that's doing relatively okay. So we're lucky that our kelp forest is doing okay. In fact, our kelp forest, funnily enough, has grown over the years and extended into areas that didn't have kelp forests for a long time, may have had in the past, so this is a system that comes and goes depending. So it's quite volatile and at the same time quite fragile and yet so resilient. It's this wonderful metaphor for life in a sense, and things can change very quickly in this forest. And it's got all these magical creatures, things that you wouldn't imagine in there. These are like nightlight jellyfish in there. And these amazing, that's a tuberculate cuttlefish. And you won't imagine what these creatures are like until you actually physically see them. It's one thing to hear about it or the story, but then to slowly go in every day and to see them and to understand that they have these complex, dramatic, detailed little lives, as complicated as anything that you would find anywhere on land, not just the big charismatic species I'm talking about. I'm talking about tiny little animals here, little mollusks that live under rocks and hide, these wonderful anemones. Everything that you see have these complicated, involved lives, and the thousands of years it's taken for them to evolve and adapt to be in this system. So our kelp forest is unique because it's fed by two amazing currents, the Benguela and the Agulhas current. It's a cold current and a warm current. So this creates a wonderful system of nutrient upwelling with the southeaster blowing in, and this nutrient upwelling allows for our forests to thrive. And the kelp, in the way that it's constructed with the fronds on the surface, the long stipe that floats in the water with the gas-filled stipe, and the holdfast at the bottom of the kelp, the root system as I call it, but it's not really a typical root system. It's something that fastens onto a rock. So it's the rocky substrata of the layer at the bottom of the ocean is what this kelp fastens itself onto. So it's not a typical root system. And this three-layered sort of structure that this kelp has allows for it to be home to hundreds of millions of animals. The fronds feed and support life, the stipe supports life, and the root and the rocky substrate support life. So our kelp forest has one of the highest levels of endemism in the world, second only to Tasmania. So that means basically the animals, some of the animals found here are found nowhere else but here in this forest. So that makes them unique. It also is one of the most biodiverse places on Earth, which means the number of species found, the numbers are higher than most other places can boast of. And also in many places per square mile, it has a biomass that's equivalent of the Serengeti. So you can imagine in the Serengeti what the sizes of the animals are and what the sizes of these animals are. But then you can imagine how numerous they must be to pound for pound match that in weight. And, for me, when I first came to Cape Town, my fear of getting into the water was basically my fear, because I'd nearly drowned and I know what that felt like, and it caused this fear psychosis in a sense that every time I put my head into water, I know that the mammalian dive reflex is supposed to kick in and make you all calm, but mine just went in the opposite direction, and my heart rate would just shoot straight through the roof and I'd literally have a panic attack. So that was a challenge, and the cold, of course, was a challenge. The animals were what actually got me in. So I would meet a lot of Cape Townians who were amazing swimmers and would swim really well, but what made them nervous was, the big animals in the kelp forest. I heard a lot of people who would tell us when we go into the water, there's so many sharks in this water and stuff. And that for me was actually what made me want to get into the water, was the animals. So this is a spotted gully shark, completely harmless, wonderful animals. If you sit really still, they can come pretty close within touching distance, very skittish, quick. If you make any kind of movement, they're gone. And they're fascinating because sometimes, since now we go in every day, my colleagues, of course, have been going in for years, but since I've been going in every day in the last 2.5 years, I noticed that there are patches where you'll see shivers of these sharks everywhere. You'll see them in big groups, and it's wonderful. And then literally the next day, they'll be just gone, like they don't exist. And the thing is, we don't know where they go. We don't know how they live. We don't know what their territory is. We don't really, we know so little. So sometimes I almost feel like that famous quote someone said, that we almost know more about Mars, in a sense, planet Mars, than we do about, the deep ocean. And for me, it's like There's the ocean, and it's there and it's on our doorstep, and we know so little about this wonderful ecosystem. And I think for Sea Change Project, we can't, our ambition isn't, of course, the whole ocean. Our desire and wish is for all oceans of the world to do well. But what we are focused on is this wonderful ecosystem on our doorstep, the Great African Sea Forest. And we want to make that a global icon. We want to create awareness about that through our storytelling, visual storytelling, raise awareness, bring this out to people. Because there are two fundamental things about the ocean that I think is always worth reiterating for everybody, because even if you know it, you may have forgotten it. And if you haven't forgotten it, it's good to just keep it in your mind every day, is that over 70% of our oxygen comes from the ocean. And that's because of phytoplankton in the ocean, plants in the ocean, over 70%. I know everyone calls the Amazon the lungs of the earth, but that is not true. The oceans are the lungs of the planet. So every second breath every human being takes on the planet, no matter where you live, no matter how landlocked you are, comes from the ocean. So a healthy ocean, from just a pure perspective of human survival, is key. And that's just breath. The ocean is what controls climate systems across the world. Every time a raindrop hits your head, a raindrop touches your skin, it is because water has evaporated from the ocean, gone up into the sky. There's condensation. Of course, rainforests have their own little climate control systems where they form sky rivers and create rain. So they do contribute to that. But the majority of the rain found on the planet, the climate systems that we talk about, is all controlled by the ocean. So literally the planet's survival, not just your and mine, the planet's survival depends on this healthy ecosystem. And for Sea Change, the kelp forest is a huge representation of that, because our kelp forest sequesters more carbon than most forests on land. Some of the sequestration is long-term because the kelp breaks away in storms, or it sheds, and most of it goes into floats away into the deeper ocean and then dribbles down into the benthic layer and gets consumed by animals. A lot of us does get washed up onto the ocean, but that is all onto our beaches. But that is also food for many animals, within that intertidal zone and that whole feeding cycle. Because we've seen all the amphipods and these animals feed on the kelp, and then we see waves wash them up, and then they're in the water, and then we see these fish surfing to eat the kelp. And we've even seen gully sharks surf up to then maybe catch some of the crabs and the fish. And then on shore, everyone must have seen so many shorebirds picking their way through kelp, eating everything that's washed up with them, because mussels get washed up and the whole fast breaks with them. Sometimes urchins get washed up. Limpets that are on the kelp get washed up with them. So it's like this enormous ecosystem which is feeding the greater health of the ocean in large. In fact, the kelp has been identified as one of 9 key ecosystems in the world, ecosystems in the ocean for greater ocean health and for regeneration of oceans. And our kelp forests, while the habitat is thriving, the issues we have is, as we all know, abalone. We've lost over 90% of that population. Rock lobster is down to 3% of its historical population. And reef fish, in a big way, have just been smashed across the board. So the big fish that you're meant to see in the kelp forest, the dramatic mussel crackers and the stump noses and the red romans and the hullion and the hottentots, you still see them. You see the red roman and the hullion and the hottentot, yes, in some of the marine protected areas, which are no-take zones, but you don't see the stump nose, and you don't see that many of the other big, very dramatic fish that you're meant to see coming through the kelp forest. And for me, the great and wonderful thing about our Great African Sea Forest is that because it's a thriving ecosystem, it has the capacity to be regenerated. It has the capacity to rewild itself. It has the capacity to be restored. And as it's been identified, kelp forests around the world have been identified as one of 9 key ecosystems within the ocean for the greater health of the ocean. I think a tremendous amount of attention needs to be paid to this ecosystem, much more than currently that's being paid to it. So that's the wonderful thing about the conservation and the biology and the aspects of the kelp forest from a biological and ecosystem point of view. Being in this lockdown and not being able to access the ocean for a while, I realized that But I would see fishing boats go out every day, and the fishing actually went up because prices had dropped because there was no exports, and it was selling to the local market at very low prices. And to make up the money, they were actually catching more fish. And, you know, a lot of more recreational fishermen were out there in the ocean and stuff. So I found it funny that that was called essential services, as in going out and fishing. And I understand that it's livelihoods and people need to eat. And yes, it's an essential service, but it made me also think about, isn't the ocean itself, isn't she herself an essential service? As I've already said, just purely from a survival point of view, but way bigger than that, just the ocean and just who we are as a people, especially with the history on this coast, with South Africa. You know, archaeology and paleontology over years have studied caves on this coast, and we now know that modern human origin, modern human behavior really originated on our coast, with families that lived and hunted and gathered on this coast from about 70,000 to about 150,000, maybe longer ago. And some of these caves have actually preserved those lives and layers of soil, which now scientists are slowly exposing and exploring and telling us that this is where the modern human really originated from. And what a history to have on this coast. You know, this coast has the longest unbroken 6,000 generational pact with humans. No other wilderness on earth can claim a 6,000 generational unbroken pact with humans, and this coast has that. And that is such an extraordinary I would say it's like something that we should be so proud of, a heritage that this country should be so proud of. And for all of its challenges in South Africa, with the poverty, with apartheid creating the rift that happened, and all of it, I still think that South Africa, in terms of marine biodiversity, is doing as well as it can with the challenges that it faces. We all know the problems. We know that poaching is rampant. We know that industrialized fishing is a problem. We know that sewerage goes into the water in many, many places. And along with sewerage, so does antibiotics that humans take and hormonal medicines that we take and all of that. And, you know, this affects filter feeders, for example, and plastic pollution, we know, is a huge problem, and we know all this comes back in the food chain when we eat, and, you know, so it's a big problem. We know that there is a threat perhaps in the future of deep sea mining that will happen, and maybe South Africa will give out licenses for that. But South Africa has also, because of the wonderful Dr. Kerry Sink of SANBI, or the South African National Biodiversity Institute, increased our protected areas from about 2% to 5% now. We have marine protected areas we should still do more. Oceans worldwide, although they cover over 70% of the Earth's surface, less than 4% or 5% is actually protected. Which is a travesty, really. Imagine 70% of the world's surface is covered by oceans, and less than 4 or 5% of the oceans is actually protected area, and less than 3% of the oceans actually has no human activity in it. So even a lot of the marine reserves and marine protected areas are not no-take zones. You know, you're allowed economic activity there. So this is something that we really need to look at going forward, because I believe, with the experience that I've had in reporting on conservation and wilderness and wildlife, I really do believe this is our magic decade. This 2020 to 2030, this 10 years, this is it. This is our window. And I think we really, really need to push for greater protection. Since we're talking about oceans right now, I'll only focus on that. Definitely for greater protections in the ocean. There is a move, it's called 30 by 30. You can look that up, basically to protect 30% of the world's oceans by 2030. It's related to the UN Sustainable Development Goals and all of that. But I think that getting up to 30% of protection of the oceans would just be fantastic if we could do it, because any of these jobs, economic activities that are linked to the ocean, in the rate at which things are changing with climate change in the ocean, none of these jobs are future proofed. So what we're doing is literally like just putting band-aids on gaping wounds, and at some point that's just not going to be enough. And if there's a gaping wound here and there's a little bit of a safe space there, then we want to increase economic activity there, because then whoever you are in charge, and I don't blame them because the challenges are huge, can just say, oh, we gave 20 jobs here or 40 jobs there. But for 20 or 40 jobs, the knock-on effect of what happens in these ecosystems and then what happens to a generation down the line is incalculable. And we can see with COVID what we've done, what's come back to us. And while the COVID is a pandemic and it's being treated as a medical challenge, which it is, we have forgotten that coronavirus is actually an environmental problem. That is what it is. It's an environmental problem. It is just presenting itself as a medical challenge. And with what it's done to us already, you can look at it and go, this probably is the most defining thing that our generation has probably faced so far, because we didn't live through wars and things like that. But the coronavirus is just the tip of an iceberg that's coming towards our Titanic. And I think that is something that, as I said, we have this decade to steer our course away from that iceberg, and we just have to do it. What's happening with the oceans as well right now is with the warming waters, a lot of animals are actually shifting habitats. Marine species are moving closer to the pole, and they're moving 6 times faster than species on land, which are also moving towards the pole, because it's just getting too hot for them to survive in many of their habitats. And so they're actually abandoning habitats and trying to find more and more spaces to fit into. And what this will do is it will cause species that have never been together to collide. It will cause species that have never mated but could potentially mate to mate, and now they're finding hybrids. What this will also do, as we hammer them while this is happening with the fishing and the hunting and the poaching and all of it, is increase the stress levels so badly that those, whatever viruses, whatever pathogens are in these animals, which they're already struggling with, which nature keeps in check, will explode, because now there's too much stress and there's too much chaos and they're not able to cope. And then we've gone and put ourselves right in the middle of that situation, creating this perfect storm of more pathogens and more zoonotics and more spillover situations to happen, which is typically what happened with the coronavirus or any of our other viruses, SARS, MERS. Even the Spanish flu was technically a zoonotic. And on land, this is of course 100,000 times more multiplied than in the ocean, and we see it as coronavirus. But it's a situation that is unhealthy, and it is something we really, really need to pay attention to. So for me, all of this information and all of this knowledge with all of this research, to be able to talk about it, to be able to write about it, to even talk to all of you about it, is because I have been in the water now for 2.5 years, and I feel that gives me a slightly authentic voice with which to speak about it. Not everybody has to become a marine biologist. Not everybody has to become a scientist. Not everybody has to become a filmmaker. But I think people, A, can definitely get themselves informed because we have access to information. And B, if you have access to wilderness around you, if it's not ocean and it's the mountain, if it's not the mountain, it's a park, if it's a lake, if it's a pond, whatever it is, that access is key and crucial and very, very important. So coming back to essential services, I think one of the things that struck me during this whole COVID crisis is the fact that I was getting irritated watching all the fishing happening, and I was getting irritated that, oh my God, like they're letting fishermen go out there and fish, and I'm not allowed to go out there and swim. People are allowed to go out there and kill the fish, but I can't go out there and just watch them, alive and living in the water. And I was getting very irritated. And then I had to rethink that, reverse back that whole thought and go, wait a minute. In South Africa, particularly, and everywhere else in the world, but in South Africa particularly, with apartheid and that system that was set in place, a whole, 5-6 generations of people were just literally cut off. That's it. Boom, not allowed. Out in wilderness, for beaches, for example, where did they have access to beaches? Most of the beaches were white only, and no one was allowed to the beach. So what you did to a whole bunch of generations, what we did to a whole bunch of generations, was we kept cutting them off from the joy of nature, the ability to be out there and just spend time in play, in joy, in discovery, in fun, spend the day out with your family. We took all that away. And the only thing they got in return was if they got employed on a fishing boat, or if they got employed to, collect something, or it was a job. So generations started looking to nature from a perspective purely as a job opportunity or a resource-oriented entity. It's those of us who had the luxury and privilege of the lives that we lead who could go spend a day on a beach and feel the sand and feel the air and breathe it in and swim in the ocean and not worry about putting the next meal on our tables. We have the ability to love nature for what it is. For a whole lot of people, it is nothing but a resource. And that is something we did to them. We created that situation for them to look at it that way. And today, if we're looking at what we're seeing and we're complaining about it, it is something that we need to acknowledge and take responsibility for and realize that this is something we did. And those of us who have that privilege and have the access and have the ability to gain the knowledge, we are actually the ones making those decisions. I may not be, you may feel better about yourself that you're not a fisherman out there killing the fish. But if you're not informed about what fish you're eating in a restaurant at the table where you're sitting, you're as culpable. And I think that these are the things that we need to start paying attention to, because it's not someone else's problem. Someone else is not the bad guy. We need to start looking at ourselves in this whole equation as key consumers of what are we doing? What are we consuming? Where is it coming from? What are we contributing to? What can we do to make this whole system better? And I think that is something I thought about a lot during the COVID. It's something I thought about a lot through my career. Because in India, I see this with the way indigenous peoples are constantly displaced because of mining or, timber or whatever else resource, oil, gas, whatever it is that they want to extract from the forest. Constantly, indigenous peoples are being displaced. And, we've now, science knows that almost 70% of the most biodiverse places, forest-wise on land at least, are in places where indigenous peoples actually are still relating to the land. That's where most of our wonderful wilderness and wildlife and biodiversity still exists. It's in the hands of the indigenous peoples. And in so many places, we've just marginalized them, disenfranchised them, thrown them out of places. And all because, as much as we feel bad about it, we're the ones driving the cars, we're the ones on the roads, we're the ones going out there and shopping. We are the consumers. And I think this is something that we really need to bear in mind, that we're very much part of the system that's causing the problem. Yes, it's a fact that there are certain corporates and companies and entities that are causing about 60% of the problem on the planet directly, because they couldn't care less about their carbon footprint. They could care less about the pollutions they leave behind. They could care less about human rights and all of that. But these are the companies also producing the products that we're consuming. So while they are definitely the biggest problem, industrialized fishing, huge problem, mining, huge problem, transportation, road construction, huge problem. But all of that is something that are services that we are availing of. So as consumers, we also need to pay attention to that. So this is something I really thought about during the lockdown, and looking at this wonderful great African sea forest in front of me. And I was just thinking, here is this forest, through all this change and turmoil and everything that's happening, the resilience, the life, the glory, and it just, it rises and falls with its own time. And that is something we need to learn from nature, is that resilience and how important that ecosystem is for us, and not just through survival, because our DNA, we're the human animal. We are part of nature. We're not outside of it. We're not, some entity that only requires it for services. We are nature. So any desecration of that natural ecosystem is a desecration of our own selves. And I think that is something that this disconnect that we've created in people from nature, and the disconnect many of us have created in ourselves with our lifestyles from nature, is one of the biggest problems in what I call the dismembering of the human psyche. And that is, for me, why we see so many issues with depression and all of these mental health issues that we're facing, and definitely rise in violence and intolerance and anger. Because when you're in nature and you connect in that deep way, what it creates in you is empathy. You start feeling and seeing life around you. You see how precious it is, how quickly it can be lost. You feel the resilience. And I think that empathy that being in nature creates, when you cut that off, you've cut off that source of empathy, which is your fundamental source of empathy. And I think that makes us, not great humans. So one of the things that really inspired me in being more focused towards being in this space was about, I think this was last year, I watched a the octopus traps in the bay killed a Brutus whale, and accidentally, of course. And I went out on a boat to do the story on how this whale died. And in about a 2-week period, I was out in that boat, I think 4 or 5 times. I think thrice there were dead whales. 1 was a Brutus whale and 2 were humpback whales. And it was a very distressing 2 weeks because these wonderful animals, it was whale season, they'd come into our bay, they'd come in to feed. And humpbacks are iconic because this is one of our greatest conservation success stories. And these whales were decimated in the 1970s and 80s, and now they're nearly back to their historical numbers. And they come to South Africa, to our shores to feed, and they were dying. And this was hugely, hugely disturbing. And so I went out with the city of Cape Town. They did a wonderful job in pulling the carcasses away and also making sure that whales that were entrapped, that were alive, were rescued alive. And so to do this story, did the story, and with a lot of other people in Cape Town who got involved in this, we managed to get to the minister, Barbara Creasy, and she banned the octopus traps in False Bay, which was huge. It was a temporary ban. The octopus fishery was told that they could come back and operate if their equipment could be certified as whale friendly. Definitely for the fishermen working on that octopus boat, that was their livelihood. So that was also really disturbing that I had done these stories asking for a ban on this fishery because of the way these whales were getting entangled. But at the same time, I knew, and I had to bear in mind, that I was asking for the ban on something that would take away the livelihood of a lot of people. And it's hard, and that's always one of the balances as a conservation journalist. It's a hard line to straddle. You try not to assign blame. Sometimes your emotions get the better of you, and you do, but you've got to place yourself in their shoes and go, oh my God, now, they've lost livelihoods, and how are their children going to eat, and how are they going to go to school? And so it was a very disturbing 2 weeks. But I knew that the fisheries and the way that the equipment was working in False Bay in particular, simply because of the way False Bay is and the way these whales come in to feed in False Bay, was very problematic. So the ban was a good thing. And frankly, many whales, were saved last year after the minister put that ban in place, because post the ban, we saw many dozens of whales come into the shallows. So after that disturbing 2 weeks that I had, I was in the Kelp Forest, within 4 to 5 meters of water, and this humpback swam right up to us when we were in the water. And when things like that happen, I know something amazing and bigger than me, and bigger than I can put in words that could rationalize it, is happening. What were the chances? Craig's been in the water for 10 years. Pippa and everyone else has been in the water for years. I'd been in the water for 3 years. And 2 weeks after we'd all agonized over this octopus fishing and the ban and the whales and everything that we'd done, this humpback whale swims right up to us in the Kelp Forest. And it was the most extraordinary wildlife experience I've had. And there's something like sometimes you feel like there's a secret door and there's a lock to that door in nature, but you go in every day, and suddenly, boom, that secret door just opens up and you're let into this space, which is an extraordinary space, which is very hard to put in words, but anyone and everyone who's experienced that in the water or on land or anywhere really will understand what I'm saying. And that experience with that humpback, and it happened to us twice with humpback whales in the water. And then a week later, a southern right in the Kelp Forest. I mean, what are the chances? And especially for someone like me, non-swimming, rather graceless, I would say ape in the water. There I got to see 2 of the most iconic species that we have in the ocean in front of me in the Kelp Forest. It just blew my mind, and that just changed everything. And I just knew that this was something I had to continue doing, because sometimes you have to listen to a greater sentience, what we call the forest mind, the mind of the Kelp Forest, the mind of that great African sea forest, which has taken millions of years in evolution to become what it is, this perfect system. And sometimes you've got to listen to that greater sentience and go, okay, I get it. Like, this is what I need to do. And I need to be in this space to experience that. So yes, I've been in the water every day since. I don't go in only if it's incredibly rough. And that's because I'm not still great at swimming in the water, and I could put my other colleagues at risk if I start to drown. But I'm taking swimming lessons. I'm able to swim with my snorkel on. And what I've started doing now is training myself to hold my breath and go down and stay down in the water in the kelp forest. So this is something that I'm doing a lot more of. And for me, as I said, this sentience is something that I really, every day before I go into the water, I do a little communication with that space, just to let that great sentience know that I'm coming in, and I'm coming in to be it. Because to be in that space, to be in the ocean, is to be in the moment. It is to live in the now. There's nothing more exhilarating and self-defining and almost like meditation, is to live in the now, because you have to pay attention every single second, every single minute to where you are, what's around you, what's happening, how the ocean feels, because this is a gigantic system that you've got to respect. That's a wonderful Hottentot that swam into my hand. Another wonderful experience, one of those days where you just go into the water and you're swimming around, and this one fish decides to follow you everywhere that you go. And then you stop and you put your hand out. You have no food, you have no bait, nothing. And he just swims straight into your hand, and you can give him a little tickle. He can't, he's also a bit puzzled probably after that interaction by thinking like, what the hell did I just do? And I'm just like completely, blown away by the fact that a wild animal has just swum into my hand. And those are the moments really that you live for. And those are the moments you're incredibly lucky if it happens to you on the odd day that you go into the water, and you can never predict nature, but definitely going in every day creates those spaces where these wonderful interactions happen more and more. I personally love the feel of the kelp around me. I love the feel of the fronds. I love the softness. I love how they, gently sort of stroke you as you're going by. As a non-swimmer, again, as someone who's still not that confident in the water, for me, just to be in the forest, I feel so safe because I feel so held and nurtured when I'm in that kelp forest, because it's like a large flotation device that I can lie on top of if I get a little too nervous, and I can just hold on to it and hang on. And so, and there's something about just floating in that forest and looking down, even if you're not physically down, and seeing that big, blue, beautiful, misty depth, and this forest just stretching out in front of you. And for someone who spent so much time in tropical forests on land, it was like coming home. And how strange that I had to find that home in an underwater sea forest. The same home that I found in my tropical jungles back home in India. And for me, that's when I knew that this is it. This is where I had to find what I call my amphibious soul, what we in Sea Change call the amphibious soul. And we're a team of, group of amphibians who swim around. And so I pull myself down in the kelp, I hold my breath, I try and stay for as long as possible. I'm trying to maximize my time at the bottom and then go to the top. This is new for me. This is something I'm still learning to do. My other colleagues, they're all great at it and do a wonderful job with that. But this is what I do. So really, with Sea Change, it's been incredible because that is really our focus. Like our tagline is "Remember, you are wild," and our hope is to bring the joy, the passion, the wonder, the discovery, and everything that we see in the ocean every day. Bring that energy to people around us, translated through our stories, through our visuals, through the films, the newsletter that we bring out, the blogs, everything, just to bring out this, to let people see what that great African sea forest is all about, because we really want it to become a global icon, just like the Serengeti or the Amazon. These are places that are so iconic that no matter where you live in the world, if you hear those names, you resonate with it emotionally. And so we want the great African sea forest to become that globally iconic. And we also want to reconnect people in that way to nature in a deeper sense, in a deeper way. So, love brings you to the table in a sense, and you want to save it for love as opposed to saving it as a resource only. And I think that's really where, I stand. And I had the privilege of interviewing Sir David Attenborough a few years ago, and I asked him, you've been doing this for 60 years, and do you not sometimes feel disenchanted or disheartened that after 60 years of doing all the work that you've done, things are worse now than ever? And he said to me, imagine how much worse things could have been if we hadn't fought for those 60 years. And that to me is key. There's always hope, especially in our great African sea forest and the way that it is and the way that that ecosystem functions. There is so much hope. And this decade, this 10 years that we have is, I would call, the decade of hope. And, maybe COVID is something that has triggered that awakening in us, that sense of urgency, that sense of understanding that we really, really, really need to get out there and do something about everything that we see around us, because, as I said, it is who we are. We're not separate from it. We are nature. Yeah.
Thank you, Swati. That was really, really beautiful. Just touching quickly on that, you said that is it a luxury for us who aren't reliant on the sea? You talked about fishermen or those people who are disenfranchised and people who don't view nature as somewhere we can play and go into and love in that way. Do you think it's sort of dependent on us to care, to make a difference? Doesn't matter if it's the sea. How do you view that?
I think it's incredibly important for those of us who have the privilege to be able to look at nature just purely through the lens of joy and wonder. I think it's incredibly important that we do that. So if you may not want to be part of an NGO, you may not want to do it that way, but if you have children, inculcate that love in them. Don't just sit behind screens and don't just sit behind digital videos and apps, and get them out there. As adults, you've also got to get out of your comfort zone and take your children out there. And that's the most wonderful thing you can do, is because if you don't teach your children the love when they're children, very difficult as adults to then pull them into that space. So I think that's something that anyone can do who has children. For those of you who don't have children and you're passionate about this, it could be any ecosystem that you're passionate about. Talk about it more, share your love. If it's your social media, if it's just spread the stories out there, put it out there. The third most important thing, as I was saying, is really inform yourself, whatever it is, just every single time. I keep saying, when we talk about recycling and reuse, I think the first word we should think about is rethink. Stop and think if you need something before you buy it. And if you don't, refuse it. If you really need it, then if you get it, then definitely think of the recycling, the reuse, the rethink, all of that. So I think that's really something we need to do. And we need to bear in mind that privilege, Michael. It's so important that we realize that if those of us who can make those choices don't make the choices, we can't put the burden on the people who don't have the capacity to make those choices. And the irony is, the people who don't have the capacity to make those choices are causing the least impact and damage. So that is something we must bear in mind.
Swati, I'm going to try get through some of the questions. If you do have any more, you please use them in the chat function. Yeah. But I've got a couple here. So Ian asks, where does the great Kelp Forest start and finish? He's from Dublin.
Yeah, so it starts, it's all the way from, I think it's about 1,200 coastline on South Africa. So if you look at the map of Africa, you go around the tip of Africa, but it stops near, I think, Cape Agulhas. De Hoop is the furthest it goes towards the Western Cape. So that's I think the outermost limit of the Cape Forest. And for the gentleman from Dublin, he needs to look at a map of Africa. And if he looks at right, the tip of Africa, a little bit past that is where the Kelp Forest sort of goes. And then from there, it goes up, past Cape Town and up further up until like Namibia. So the coast of Namibia has a kelp forest as well, and it stops there. Yeah, so it's between 1,200 kilometer coastline, kelp. And on average, it spreads out to about 100 meters in the ocean. In some areas, if a reef is out at 200 or 250 meters or 300, you might find kelp. But on average, the depth is about 100 meters, as in the distance of the forest is about 100 meters out into the ocean on average. And the length it covers is about 1,200 kilometers, yeah.
Pat wanted to know, I suppose this is a question you get asked a lot. Do you ever feel like overwhelmed by nature being destroyed? Especially yourself and Craig worked on octopuses and made that beautiful film, which is coming to Netflix soon. I hope you'll all watch it.
Yeah.
But do you ever feel sort of overwhelmed and disillusioned that nature is being destroyed, or do you have the same view like David Attenborough does?
Yeah, so it can be extremely upsetting sometimes. As I said, particularly when we were in right there when things were happening with the whales, it was very upsetting. There are times when you go in for a swim and you just see so much plastic in the forest, and we pick that up, and then that gets upsetting. There are many times we've done these tidal walks or shore walks, and we find fishing lines entwined around dead birds or dead seals, and that's upsetting. So yes, of course, I mean, you can't help but get upset, because if you're in an ecosystem a lot, if you just love nature in general, you can't help but react emotionally to what you're seeing. But I think one must never lose sight of the fact that life is incredibly resilient, because I've also seen very degraded ecosystems bounce back amazingly when they're given the chance to do so. So you understand the kind of resilience life has, and how quickly it will recover, and how wonderfully it can actually thrive again, even though you've brought it to the brink. And so I think that gives me a lot of hope. And I also think that just being in this wonderful forest every day, because our forest, with all of its challenges, as I said, is still doing well compared to kelp forests around the world, so the Great African Sea Forest is doing well. So being in that forest every day, being let into that secret world, seeing the biodiversity, the biomass, the absolute wonder of what it is in that floating forest, it's very hard to stay upset or sad for too long, because it's just such a feeling of connection and joy, and this great inner peace that comes with it. And you realize that it is a challenge, and that's what you have to see it as a challenge. But the most wonderful thing about a challenge is the person on the other end of it, because ultimately, imagine, we have so much power. It all comes down to choices we make. That's the kind of power we have, and which is actually a very empowering thing when you think about it, is that you can actually make a difference and you can make the right choices. And as I said, I think this decade is crucial to do so.
And people are asking, where do they find out more about the Scene Change Project? I shared very quickly the beautiful book that was written, and I urge everyone to buy it. But your website?
Yes, so if you go on to seachangeproject.com, seachangeproject, all one word, .com, our website comes up. Shortly, as Michael said, the film My Octopus Teacher, featuring Craig and directed by Pippa Ehrlich, one of our Sea Change colleagues, and another gentleman called James Reed from England. The entire Sea Change team, of course, worked on the film and helped with everything. Our film will be out on Netflix, I think, in September, October. It is the first full-length feature documentary film on the kelp forests of not just South Africa. I don't think there's been a full-length feature documentary film on kelp forests really anywhere, but definitely it's a first full-length feature-length documentary film on the kelp forest. And the Sea Change book is available in most bookstores. And so, if you want to know more, or it's a wonderful book which gives you a glimpse into not just what is in the forest and the beauty of it, but what it can do for the human spirit. And I think the movie does the same. And so if you get onto our website, seachangeproject.com, and you can sign up for our newsletter. We bring out a newsletter every month with news about our Great African Sea Forest and what's happening with the Sea Change team and what we're doing. So for anyone who's interested, just get onto seachangeproject.com.
I know you touched briefly on COVID, but I know it's something that's also close to your heart. Do you think that there is hope coming from COVID? Do you think that it's really laid bare this hyper-capitalistic society we live in? And could you just tell us one or two stories about the positives that came out from India, what you were seeing, and the industries that were shut down? And what is your hope going forward?
So in India, for example, usually we have, if there's like the global survey of the most polluted cities in the world, 13 out of 20 cities you'll find in India, Delhi being the most polluted in the world, and Bombay and all of this, and smaller towns as well. And this is all because a lot of it is industrial activity. And the interesting thing is, of course, because of COVID, there was a hard shutdown. So everything just went into lockdown. And the next thing you knew is, from a small town in Punjab, the Dhauladars, which is the range of the Himalayas, were visible for the first time in I don't know how many years. There was a whole generation of people who live in that town who'd never seen the Dhauladars. They didn't even know that you could actually see it. So that was a revelation. The skies were blue. Our pollution levels crashed to double digits. I mean, it was ridiculous. We've never had such blue skies. The Ganga was certified as drinkable in certain areas. Otherwise, the Ganga was at one point so polluted that it was declared a cancer-causing river, and people were advised not to drink the water. And here, suddenly, in many, many places, it became suitable for drinking. We have another river called the Yamuna, which normally flows with this toxic, almost radioactive sludge on top, and that was flowing clear and blue. One of the most rare dolphins, one of the Irrawaddy dolphins, I think, or the pink blind dolphin, which had not been spotted in years, was suddenly seen in the Jhelum River in Punjab. All these extraordinary things were happening. Wildlife spotted in areas they hadn't been seen before, not because they were increasing in number, but simply because they could now move to spaces where there was no human activity. So they spread out a lot more. That's when you realize how secretive and how confined and how difficult life is really for wildlife. Even in Cape Town, I saw caracal twice in front of my house, which I hadn't in 10 years of living here. I mean, I've seen their pug marks and I've seen scat and I've seen evidence of them, but I've not physically seen a caracal. I mean, it killed a dassie in front of me, like right there. So it was like amazing. And so you realize how nature actually has adapted to our activity around it. We need to learn to share spaces with nature. That's what we haven't learned. And I think COVID, if it's done anything, should make most people, anyone who's paying attention, realize that this is where it's at. The coronavirus is also, as I said, an environmental problem. This is something that we have to understand happened because of how we've been treating the natural world, and how the global wildlife trade is just out of control at this point, which then leads to these animals finding themselves in wet markets, etc., etc. So that's another problem. So I think that if we've had time, again, those of us who've been lucky, I have to keep stressing this because there are many, many people who've lost loved ones during this time. There are many people who lost jobs, livelihoods, homes. It's been a tragedy for a lot of people. And again, the greatest burden has fallen on the weakest populations, which is, again, a massive, massive tragedy. And I think this is something this is another thing, if you have not paid attention to the great inequality in which you live, and if you have not paid attention to the great privilege that you have of living the lives that you lead, which is not because you've earned it, it's because of sheer luck of birth, in a sense. And I think if you haven't woken up to these factors, and hopefully that's what coronavirus has done, is it's woken up these things that had perhaps gone to sleep in a lot of us for a while. So for me, that's the silver lining that I see with it. And I think also to understand just how ridiculously fragile the hyper-capitalist system is. I mean, the first big threat, and it just collapsed. And it collapsed in a way where it couldn't even support the people who are sort of the backbone of that. What we've come to realize in this coronavirus is the people who we thought were the least important in society from a class point of view. I don't know if they're your janitors or your daily wagers or your workers or your immigrant labor, whatever it is that people in their heads think, oh, this guy just comes to work on my garden, or that guy's just working on the road, or this guy is doing this. They turned out to be the most essential people during a crisis, because those of us who sheltering at home, worried about the virus, would have just collapsed without the people checking grocery out for us at the shops and delivering it at home and keeping our roads clean and our sewage system working and our electricity going. They turned out to be the most essential people in society. I mean, if I vanished tomorrow, it would not make a dent. But if some of those people vanish tomorrow, we'd be in big, big trouble. So I think these kind of perspectives, if coronavirus hasn't woken up in us, then I don't know what you've been doing through this whole crisis.
Thank you, Swati. Thank you for sharing this evening all your stories. Thank you for reminding us that we are nature and we are connected. And once again, I think what the series has done is just reminded us that a few passionate people, your Sea Change team is less than 10 people, yet you...
7 of us, yeah.
Yeah, 7 of you, and you're putting this giant sea forest on the world's map. And we really appreciative of what you're doing. Please keep sharing your stories, and have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me, Michael. It was lovely. Thank you.
Keep well. Thank you, everyone, and join us again next week when we go to the Wild Coast and discover some of the hidden secrets there. Good night. Thanks again. Bye.